There are places in this world that seem to hold their breath, waiting. The Whitmore House in rural Claremont County, Ohio, was such a place. A Victorian mansion that had stood empty for 120 years, its windows dark, its rooms thick with the accumulated silence of decades. I first encountered the property through an estate sale advertisement that appeared in the Cincinnati Enquirer on a gray October morning. The listing was brief, almost reluctant. Historic Whitmore Estate, contents and structure, viewing by appointment only, serious inquiries. What drew my attention was not what the advertisement said, but what it conspicuously omitted. No photographs, no mention of the property's considerable acreage, no romantic descriptions of Victorian charm or architectural details that typically accompany such listings. The house itself stood 3 stories tall, its Gothic Revival architecture marked by pointed arch windows and elaborate gingerbread trim that had long since begun to curl and peel. The front porch sagged under the weight of neglect, its floorboards soft with rot. Ivy had claimed the eastern wall entirely, creating a living shroud that obscured the original limestone facade. The grounds, once carefully manicured, had surrendered to wild growth, brambles and volunteer saplings, creating an almost impenetrable barrier between the house and the county road. What struck me most profoundly was the quality of silence that surrounded the property. Not the peaceful quiet of rural countryside, but something heavier, more deliberate. Even the birds seemed to avoid the towering oak trees that ringed the house. Local residents, when pressed for information about the property's history, would offer only the most basic facts before their expressions would close, their answers becoming clipped and evasive. The house had belonged to the Whitmore family, they would say. The last resident had been a child, an orphan named Evelyn. She had died there in 1903. The property had remained in legal limbo ever since, passing through various distant relatives and trustees, none of whom had shown any inclination to occupy or maintain it. But there was something else, something that lingered in the pauses between their words, in the way their eyes would drift toward the overgrown driveway when they spoke of the place. The child, they would mention almost reluctantly, had been peculiar. She spoke strangely, they said. Backward, some claimed, though they seemed uncertain of what this meant or why it should matter after so many decades. It was in these half-finished conversations, these incomplete recollections, that I began to sense the true weight of what had occurred within those deteriorating walls. The Whitmore house was not simply abandoned, it was avoided, not forgotten, but deliberately unremembered. And at the center of this careful forgetting was the figure of 12-year-old Evelyn, an orphan whose final months of life had somehow cast a shadow long enough to stretch across an entire century. The autumn wind moved through the bare branches surrounding the property, creating a sound like whispered warnings. Standing before those darkened windows, I could almost feel the weight of unspoken secrets pressing against the glass from within, secrets that had been carefully sealed away, but never truly resolved. The circumstances that brought Evelyn Whitmore to that isolated house began with fire. On March 17, 1902, the Riverside Cotton Mill in downtown Cincinnati suffered a catastrophic blaze that claimed 14 lives, including those of Thomas and Margaret Henley, Evelyn's parents. The child, who had been staying with neighbors while her parents worked the night shift, found herself suddenly orphaned and alone in the world. The county records preserved in the basement archives of the Claremont County Courthouse tell the story of Evelyn's placement with clinical detachment. Margaret Henley had been born Margaret Whitmore, the youngest daughter of a family that had settled in the area in the 1840s. When the county authorities sought relatives willing to assume guardianship of the child, only one family member came forward, Jeremiah Whitmore, Margaret's distant cousin who lived with his wife Sarah in the family's ancestral home. The Whitmores were known in the community, though not well understood. Jeremiah worked sporadically as a lecturer on spiritual matters, traveling to Cincinnati and Columbus to address small gatherings interested in what he termed the science of communication beyond the veil. Sarah was said to be gifted with second sight, able to commune with the departed through various methods she had learned from her grandmother, who had come to Ohio from the mountains of West Virginia carrying what she called the old knowledge. Neighbors described the couple as respectable but unusual, people who kept to themselves and were often seen burning strange herbs in their garden at dawn, or hosting small gatherings of visitors who arrived after dark and left before sunrise. The Whitmores claimed these activities were part of their spiritual practice, their attempt to maintain contact with deceased family members and to offer comfort to others who had suffered loss. Young Evelyn arrived at the Whitmore house in April of 1902. She was described by her former neighbors as a bright, talkative child who had been devoted to her parents and had shown no signs of the peculiar behavior that would soon define her final year of life. The transformation began almost immediately. Within weeks of her arrival, Evelyn's speech patterns began to change. At first, the alteration was subtle, occasional words pronounced strangely, sentences that seemed to stumble over themselves. Her new teacher at the one-room schoolhouse noted in her records that the child appeared to be struggling with some form of speech impediment that had not been present when she first enrolled. But as the weeks progressed, the nature of Evelyn's altered speech became clear. She was not stammering or mispronouncing words, she was speaking them backward. Every syllable, every word emerged from her lips in perfect reverse order. Good morning became Jninrom Dug. Thank you became Oi Knot. The transformation was complete and consistent, as if her very language had been inverted, turned inside out like a garment worn wrong side forward. The Whitmores, rather than seeking medical attention for what others might have considered a disturbing development, proclaimed it a gift. Jeremiah told concerned neighbors that Evelyn was speaking the language of the other side, where all things existed in reverse reflection of our world. Sarah claimed that the child had been chosen as a vessel for communication between the living and the dead, and that her backward speech was evidence of her growing connection to the spiritual realm. The local physician, Dr. Cornelius Webb, examined Evelyn at the insistence of her former teacher, and found no physical cause for her speech alteration. His notes, preserved in the county medical records, describe a healthy child showing no signs of neurological damage or physical trauma. Yet he noted something troubling in his observations. The child's eyes held a quality of watchful wariness that seemed far too old for her years, and she appeared to be listening to something that others could not hear. As autumn deepened into winter, Evelyn's isolation from the normal world of childhood became complete. She no longer attended school regularly, and when she did appear, her backward speech made communication with her classmates impossible. The Whitmores withdrew her from public education entirely, claiming they would provide her instruction at home, instruction that they insisted must include development of her spiritual gifts. The arrangement that had been intended to provide a grieving child with family and stability had instead placed her into the hands of people who saw her not as a person in need of care, but as a conduit for their own obsessions with the world beyond death. The winter of 1902 marked the beginning of what the Whitmores called Evelyn's true education. Letters preserved in the County Historical Society, written by Sarah Whitmore to her sister in West Virginia, describe a systematic program designed to enhance the child's supposed spiritual abilities. These letters, discovered only in 1987 during the donation of a family estate, reveal the full extent of what Evelyn was subjected to during her months in the Whitmore household. Sarah wrote of daily exercises designed to strengthen Evelyn's connection to the spirit world. The child was required to spend hours each day in the house's basement, a stone-walled chamber that Sarah referred to as the Rossing Room. Here, surrounded by candles and what Sarah described as artifacts of communion, bones, dried herbs, mirrors arranged in specific patterns, Evelyn was instructed to practice speaking with the dead. The Whitmores had converted the basement into what could only be described as a shrine to death. The walls were lined with photographs of deceased family members dating back 3 generations. Tables held collections of personal items that had belonged to the dead. Spectacles, jewelry, locks of hair preserved in small glass vials. At the center of the room stood a large circular table marked with symbols that Sarah claimed were doorways, marks that would help guide spirits from their realm into ours. It was in this underground chamber that the seances began. 3 times weekly, the Whitmores would gather with a small circle of like-minded individuals from the surrounding counties. Evelyn, speaking only in her reversed language, was placed at the center of these gatherings and instructed to serve as the primary medium through which the spirits would communicate. The local newspaper, the Clermont County Gazette, published several accounts of these seances during the winter of 1902 and 1903. The articles, written in the sensational style common to the period, described miraculous communications with deceased relatives and claimed that Evelyn's backward speech was actually the language of the dead, who existed in a realm where all earthly things were reflected in reverse. But beneath the newspaper's breathless reporting lay a more troubling reality. Dr. Webb's private notes, found among his papers after his death in 1934, describe his growing concern for Evelyn's physical and mental health. During his few opportunities to examine the child, he noted significant weight loss, chronic fatigue, and what he termed an unnatural pallor that suggested prolonged confinement away from sunlight. More disturbing were Dr. Webb's observations of Evelyn's behavior during these examinations. The child, he wrote, seemed to exist in a state of constant vigilance, as if expecting some form of danger that only she could perceive. She would often pause in the middle of speaking, even her backward speech, and cock her head as if listening to sounds that no one else could hear. When asked about her experiences in the Whitmore household, she would respond only in her inverted language, making meaningful communication impossible. The doctor's notes also reveal his suspicion that Evelyn's backward speech was not the supernatural gift the Whitmores proclaimed it to be, but rather a psychological defense mechanism, her mind's way of protecting her from something she was being forced to witness or participate in. He theorized that by speaking in reverse, the child was unconsciously preventing herself from giving voice to words or concepts that her psyche recognized as dangerous. Dr. Webb's concerns were shared by others in the community. The local minister, Reverend Samuel Clark, wrote to the county authorities expressing his belief that the child was being subjected to practices that were harmful to her spiritual and psychological well-being. His letters describe his attempts to visit Evelyn, only to be turned away by the Whitmores, who claimed that outside interference would disrupt the child's spiritual development. But perhaps the most revealing document from his period is a letter written by Margaret Whitmore, Sarah's mother-in-law, who lived in the neighboring county. In correspondence with a friend, the elderly woman expressed her horror at what she witnessed during a visit to the house. She described finding Evelyn in the basement chamber, pale and trembling, surrounded by adults who were demanding that she speak properly to summon a specific spirit. The child, Margaret wrote, appeared terrified and exhausted, yet continued to respond only in her backward language, as if her life depended on never allowing certain words to pass her lips in their correct form. It was becoming clear that Evelyn's reversed speech, rather than being a gift, was actually her attempt to maintain some form of control in a situation where she had none. By speaking backward, she could participate in the rituals without actually speaking the words that might complete whatever dark ceremonies the Whitmores were attempting to conduct. The boundary between worlds, it seemed, was not something the Whitmores were seeking to cross. It was something Evelyn was desperately trying to maintain. In March of 1923, 20 years after Evelyn's death, the Whitmore house underwent partial renovation when the property was briefly inherited by a distant relative who had plans to convert it into a boarding house. It was during the demolition of a wall in what had been Evelyn's bedroom that workers made a discovery that would cast the child's story in an entirely new and deeply troubling light. Hidden within the wall cavity, wrapped in oilcloth and carefully sealed against moisture, was a leather-bound diary. The journal was small, no larger than a prayer book, with a brass clasp that had tarnished black with age. The pages within were covered with text written in the same backward script that had characterized Evelyn's speech, line after line of reversed letters, forming words that could only be read with the aid of a mirror. The diary was initially turned over to Professor Edmund Hartwell of the University of Cincinnati's Department of Classical Languages, who had developed an interest in unusual forms of writing and cipher. What Professor Hartwell discovered as he painstakingly translated each entry would haunt him for the remainder of his life and ultimately contribute to his decision to abandon his academic career and retreat into religious seclusion. The earliest entries, dating from April 1902, just after Evelyn's arrival at the Whitmore house, reveal a child struggling to understand the strange new world she had been thrust into. Written in her reversed script, her initial observations seem almost innocent. Descriptions of her new room, uncertainty about her guardian's unusual habits, homesickness for her deceased parents. But as the entries progress through the spring and summer of 1902, a pattern of growing distress becomes apparent. Evelyn writes of being taken to the basement room for lessons that she doesn't understand, of adults who gather in the evenings to speak to empty chairs as if people were sitting in them. She describes her confusion when the Whitmores praise her for speaking backward, telling her it is a gift that will help her bring voices from the quiet place. The child's growing awareness of her situation is documented with heartbreaking clarity. By June of 1902, her entries reveal that she has begun to understand that her backward speech is not viewed by her guardians as a problem to be solved, but as a tool to be used. She writes of being placed at the center of circles of adults who ask her to repeat specific phrases, always backward, while they listen for responses from spirits they believe she is summoning. Professor Hartwell's translation notes indicate that as he worked through the summer entries of 1902, he began to recognize that Evelyn's reversed rishant Ting served the same protective function as her reverse speech. By recording her experiences in backward script, she was creating a barrier between herself and the full horror of what she was being forced to participate in. The very act of writing in reverse seemed to provide her with psychological distance from events that were too traumatic for her young mind to process directly. The autumn entries of 1902 mark a significant shift in Evelyn's understanding of her situation. She begins to write about the hungry ones, entities that she believes the adults are trying to contact through her reversed speech. These beings, she writes, are not the peaceful spirits of deceased relatives that the Whitmores claim to be summoning, but something else entirely, something that exists in the spaces between life and death and feeds on the energy of the living. Evelyn's diary reveals her growing terror as she realizes that her guardians are not trying to communicate with the dead, but to open doorways that should remain closed. She writes of nighttime sessions in the basement where she is forced to repeat specific incantations backward, while the adults record her words and attempt to decode their meaning. She describes sensing presences in the room during these sessions, cold spots that move independently, sounds that seem to come from within the walls themselves, and most disturbing of all, voices that whisper responses to her backward speech in languages she doesn't recognize. The winter entries of 1902 to 1903 document Evelyn's desperate attempts to resist the role she has been forced into. She writes of deliberately mispronouncing even her backward words, hoping to prevent whatever the adults are trying to accomplish. She describes pretending to be ill to avoid the basement sessions, only to be forced to participate regardless of her physical condition. Most heartbreaking of all are her entries about her growing isolation from the normal world of childhood. She writes of watching through her bedroom window as children from neighboring farms play in the snow, knowing that her backward speech has made it impossible for her to join them. She describes her longing for her deceased parents and her growing certainty that the Whitmores' seances are not bringing her closer to them, but instead drawing the attention of entities that have nothing to do with love or family connection. The final entries, dating from February and early March of 1903, reveal Evelyn's understanding that the adults around her are growing impatient with her resistance. They have begun to realize that her backward speech is not an unconscious spiritual gift, but a deliberate form of sabotage. She writes of their attempts to force her to speak certain phrases correctly, and her terror at what might happen if she complies. Professor Hartwell's notes indicate that translating these final entries left him physically ill. The child's words reveal her growing certainty that she is going to die, and her desperate hope that her death might somehow prevent the completion of whatever ritual the Whitmores are attempting to perform. The diary's final entry, dated March 14, 1903, consists of a single line repeated over and over in her backward script. "I will not let them through. I will not let them through. I will not let them through." 3 days later, Evelyn Whitmore was dead. The events of March 17, 1903, exactly 1 year after the fire that had claimed Evelyn's parents, were documented in multiple sources, though the accounts vary in disturbing ways that suggest the witnesses themselves were unsure of what they had observed. Dr. Webb's medical report, filed with the county coroner, states that he was summoned to the Whitmore house at approximately 3:30 in the morning. He arrived to find the child deceased in the basement chamber, surrounded by the remnants of what appeared to have been an interrupted seance. Candles had been overturned, the circular table had been split down the middle as if by tremendous force, and the mirrors that lined the walls had all shattered simultaneously, their fragments scattered across the stone floor. The Whitmores and their 3 visitors that evening, members of their regular spiritual circle, gave conflicting accounts of what had transpired. Jeremiah claimed that Evelyn had finally agreed to speak properly during the ritual, but that the spiritual forces contacted had been too powerful for her young body to contain. Sarah insisted that malevolent entities had attacked the child when she attempted to facilitate communication with peaceful spirits. But it was the account given by one of the visitors, a woman named Catherine Mills from the neighboring county, that provided the most detailed and most disturbing description of Evelyn's final moments. Mrs. Mills, who had attended several previous seances, later told investigators that the March 17th gathering had been different from the beginning. According to Mrs. Mills, the Whitmores had spent weeks preparing for what they called the Great Translation, a ritual that would allow them to establish permanent contact with specific spiritual entities. They had somehow obtained what they believed to be the correct pronunciation of an incantation that Evelyn had been speaking backward for months, and they were determined to force her to speak these words properly during the ritual. Mrs. Mills described the scene in the basement chamber. Evelyn seated at the center of the circle, pale and trembling, while the adults around her repeated the phonetic pronunciation of words they had decoded from her reversed speech. The child, Mrs. Mills reported, seemed to be in a state of absolute terror, tears streaming down her face as she continued to speak only in her protective backward language. As the pressure mounted for her to speak correctly, Mrs. Mills witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The child began to convulse, not with illness, but as if she were engaged in some tremendous internal struggle. It was as if, Mrs. Mills later told the county sheriff, 2 forces were battling for control of Evelyn's voice, one trying to force certain words from her lips in their proper order, and another desperately preventing them from being spoken. The climax came when Jeremiah Whitmore, growing frustrated with the child's resistance, grabbed her shoulders and demanded that she repeat a specific phrase exactly as he pronounced it. For a moment, according to Mrs. Mills, Evelyn's backward speech faltered. A single word, just one word, emerged from her lips in its correct forward pronunciation. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Mrs. Mills described a sound like thunder that seemed to come from within the walls themselves, followed by a sensation of pressure that made it difficult to breathe. The candle flames turned from yellow to deep blue, and the temperature in the room dropped so precipitously that their breath became visible. Most disturbing of all, Mrs. Mills reported hearing voices, not the gentle communications of deceased relatives that they had been expecting, but harsh, inhuman sounds that seemed to be emerging from the mirrors that lined the chamber walls. At the center of it all was Evelyn, her eyes wide with terror as she realized what was happening. According to Mrs. Mills, the child made one final, desperate attempt to restore her protective barrier of reversed speech, but it was too late. Whatever doorway her carefully maintained backward language had been holding closed was now beginning to open. The child's death was as sudden as it was mysterious. One moment she was struggling to speak in her protective reversed language, and the next she simply stopped. Not just her speech, but her breathing, her heartbeat, her very life force seemed to cease all at once, as if something had been torn from her so violently that her physical form could not survive the separation. Dr. Webb's autopsy found no cause of death. The child's body showed no signs of disease, injury, or physical trauma. Her heart was healthy, her lungs clear, her brain free of any abnormalities that might explain her sudden death. From a medical standpoint, 12-year-old Evelyn Whitmore had simply stopped living. But Professor Hartwell's translation of her diary suggested a different interpretation. The child had not died of natural causes or supernatural attack, but of the tremendous psychological and spiritual strain of maintaining her protective barrier against forces she intuitively understood were too dangerous to allow into the world. Her death had been the ultimate expression of her resistance, a final refusal to serve as a conduit for entities that sought to use her as a doorway between worlds. In the end, Evelyn's backward speech had not been a spiritual gift or a psychological disorder, but an act of profound courage, A 12-year-old child faced with adults who were determined to use her as a tool for their own dark purposes had found a way to protect not only herself, but potentially the entire world from consequences she was too young to fully understand, but wise enough to resist. Her death on March 17, 1903, had occurred at the precise moment when her protective barrier finally failed, when someone succeeded in forcing her to speak correctly the words she had been inverting for months. In that moment, whatever doorway her backward speech had been holding closed began to open, and the only way to prevent the completion of the ritual was for the conduit herself to cease to exist. The child had chosen death over complicity, silence over the unleashing of forces that should remain forever beyond the boundary between worlds. The aftermath of Evelyn's death created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate circle of those present that March evening. Within a week of the child's funeral, Professor Hartwell, the scholar who had painstakingly translated her diary, was found dead in his university office, slumped over his desk with the translated pages scattered before him. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though Professor Hartwell was only 34 years old and had shown no previous signs of cardiac problems. His colleagues noted that in the days following his completion of the translation, he had become increasingly agitated, speaking frequently of words that should never be read aloud and doorways that had been cracked open. His final lecture, delivered the day before his death, had been an incoherent rambling about the dangers of forcing meaning from communications that were deliberately obscured. Dr. Webb, whose medical expertise had been called upon to examine both Evelyn and later Professor Hartwell, began experiencing what he described in his private notes as auditory disturbances, sounds that seemed to emerge from the walls of buildings, voices speaking in reversed language that he could almost but not quite understand. His notes indicate that these experiences intensified whenever he attempted to discuss Evelyn's case with colleagues or write formal reports about her death. The pattern continued with disturbing consistency. Mrs. Catherine Mills, the seance participant who had provided the most detailed account of Evelyn's final moments, died in her sleep less than a month after giving her statement to authorities. The county sheriff who had investigated the case suffered a nervous breakdown and abandoned his position, claiming that he could no longer enter buildings without hearing backwards whispers coming from empty rooms. Most significantly, the other individuals who had been present during the final seance, the Whitmores and their two remaining guests, all died within 6 months of Evelyn's death, each under circumstances that medical authorities found impossible to explain satisfactorily. The Whitmore house itself seemed to have been fundamentally altered by the events of that March evening. Neighbors reported that the building now emitted sounds that had not been present before, creaking and settling noises that occurred not during temperature changes or storms, but during periods of absolute stillness. Children walking past the property on their way to school claimed they could hear a voice coming from within the walls, speaking words they couldn't understand, but which made them feel deeply uneasy. By 1905, local authorities had decided that the diary and all related documents posed what they termed a public health hazard. The translated pages were sealed in a lead-lined box and turned over to representatives of the Catholic Church, who declared the materials spiritually dangerous and removed them to an undisclosed location where they would be properly contained. But the careful containment of physical documents could not address the psychological legacy of what had occurred. Families throughout Clermont County began reporting that their children were occasionally speaking backward, not consistently, as Evelyn had done, but in moments of stress or fear, as if her protective mechanism had somehow become contagious. The phenomenon was most commonly observed in children between the ages of 8 and 14, particularly those who had any connection to families that had been present during the Whitmore's seances. Parents described their children waking from nightmares and speaking in reversed language for several minutes before their normal speech returned. Teachers noted students who would occasionally answer questions backward when discussing topics related to death or loss. Dr. Marcus Thornton, who had replaced Dr. Webb as the area's primary physician, documented dozens of these cases between 1903 and 1908. His notes suggest that he initially viewed the phenomenon as a form of psychological contagion, children mimicking behavior they had heard described by adults. But as the cases continued, often involving children who had no direct knowledge of Evelyn's story, Dr. Thornton began to consider more disturbing possibilities. His 1909 report to the State Medical Board describes his theory that certain traumatic events could create what he termed psychic impressions that affected sensitive individuals within a geographic area. He theorized that Evelyn's desperate use of reverse speech as a protective mechanism had somehow imprinted itself on the local environment, creating a tendency for other children to unconsciously adopt the same defensive strategy when faced with experiences that threatened their psychological well-being. The Whitmore property itself changed hands 17 times between 1903 and 1923, with no family able to remain for more than 2 years. Each set of occupants reported the same phenomena: voices speaking backward in empty rooms, children in the family developing temporary speech reversal, and an overwhelming sense that something in the house was listening, waiting for someone to speak the wrong words in the right order. By 1923, when the diary was discovered during renovation work, local residents had developed an unspoken agreement to avoid discussing the property or its history in detail. Children were warned away from the house without being told why, and newcomers to the area were given vague warnings about the Whitmore place without specific explanations. The discovery of the diary briefly renewed interest in Evelyn's story, but the mysterious death of the renovation workers who had found it, both men died in their sleep within days of the discovery, reinforced the community's instinct to leave certain secrets buried. The ripples of silence that had emanated from that basement chamber in 1903 had become a permanent feature of the local landscape, a recognition that some doors, once cracked open, could never be fully closed again. The community had learned to live with the knowledge that certain words should never be spoken aloud, certain places should remain undisturbed, and certain silences should be respected above all else. As I conclude this investigation into the life and death of Evelyn Whitmore, I find myself confronting questions that extend far beyond the specific tragedy of one child's exploitation by adults who confuse their own obsessions with spiritual truth. The story of the orphan who spoke backward forces us to examine the broader pattern of children throughout history who have been placed in the impossible position of serving as conduits for adult attempts to breach the boundaries between the known and the unknowable. The historical record is filled with accounts of children who have been thrust into roles as spiritual intermediaries, their natural sensitivity to psychological nuance interpreted as supernatural ability. From the children of Salem who found themselves at the center of witch trials, to the young mediums of the Victorian spiritualist movement, to the more recent phenomena of children reporting paranormal experiences in homes their families deem haunted, we see a recurring pattern: adults who have lost something precious seeking to use children as bridges to what they have lost. What makes Evelyn's story particularly haunting is not the supernatural elements that may or may not have been present in the Whitmore house, but the very real psychological courage she displayed in developing her own system of protection. A 12-year-old child, faced with adults who were determined to use her as a tool for their own purposes, found a way to participate in their rituals while simultaneously sabotaging them. Her backward speech was not a spiritual gift or a psychological disorder, but a form of resistance so subtle that her captors initially mistook it for compliance. The phenomenon of children developing protective mechanisms when faced with adult behavior that threatens their psychological safety is well documented in psychological literature. What is less common law, I recognized, is the profound wisdom that children often display in creating these protections. Evelyn's reversal of her speech represented an intuitive understanding that certain words, when spoken in certain contexts, could unleash consequences that should be avoided at all costs. Her story also illuminates the dangerous territory that opens when adults mistake their own grief and longing for spiritual insight. The Whitmores, in their desire to maintain contact with deceased family members, had convinced themselves that a traumatized child's protective mechanism was actually a divine gift. Their inability to see past their own needs to the welfare of the child in their care ultimately led to the very tragedy they had been trying to prevent through their spiritual practices. The continuing reports of children in the area, occasionally speaking backwards, suggest that Evelyn's protective strategy may have become, in some sense, part of the psychological landscape of the region. Whether this represents some form of supernatural influence or simply the power of trauma to create lasting impressions on the collective memory of a community is less important than what it reveals about the human capacity for unconscious wisdom. Children, particularly those who have experienced loss or trauma, often develop ways of protecting themselves that adults fail to recognize or respect. Evelyn's backward speech was her way of maintaining some form of agency in a situation where she had been stripped of all conventional power. By speaking in reverse, she could appear to cooperate with the adults' demands while actually preventing the completion of whatever rituals they were attempting to perform. The estate sale advertisement that first drew my attention to this story has been withdrawn. The property, which had briefly seemed destined for renovation and new occupancy, has returned to its familiar state of benign neglect. Local authorities cite structural concerns and environmental issues, but those familiar with the area's history understand the real reason for the decision to leave the Whitmore house undisturbed. There is wisdom in this collective choice to let certain places remain silent. Not all mysteries require solution, and not all silences demand to be broken. Sometimes the most profound act of respect we can offer to those who have suffered is to honor their decision to keep certain truths unspoken. Evelyn Whitmore died protecting a boundary that she understood, even at 12 years old, should not be crossed. Her legacy is not the supernatural phenomena that may or may not continue to manifest in the area around her former home, but the reminder that children often possess an intuitive wisdom about danger that adults, in their eagerness to achieve their own goals, fail to recognize or respect. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson from Evelyn's story is the recognition that some forms of silence are not empty spaces waiting to be filled with sound, but active forms of protection that should be maintained at all costs. Her backward speech was not a barrier to communication, but a sophisticated form of communication in itself, a way of saying no to adults who had not given her permission to refuse their demands directly. The orphan who spoke backward understood something that the adults around her had forgotten, that some doors should remain closed. Some words should never be spoken aloud, and some silences are the most profound form of speech available to those who lack the power to speak freely in any other way. Her death at the moment when her protective barrier finally failed stands as a testament to the lengths that even a child will go to prevent the unleashing of forces she intuitively recognizes as dangerous. In choosing death over complicity, silence over the completion of rituals that should never have been attempted, Evelyn Whitmore demonstrated a form of courage that continues to echo through the decades that have passed since her final, desperate act of protection. The boundary between worlds remains intact, held in place not by supernatural forces, but by the collective recognition of a community that has learned to respect the wisdom of a child who understood that some things are too dangerous to allow into the light of day. Her legacy is the understanding that sometimes the most profound act of love is learning to speak in ways that prevent certain truths from taking form in the world, and that the deepest form of protection is knowing when to remain silent. The Whitmore house stands empty still, its windows dark, its rooms thick with the accumulated weight of secrets that have chosen to remain unspoken. And perhaps, in a world too eager to force light into every shadow, there is wisdom in allowing some mysteries to keep their silence, some boundaries to remain uncrossed, and some protections to endure beyond the brief lives of those who created them. In the end, Evelyn Whitmore's backward speech continues to serve its original purpose, keeping certain words from being spoken correctly, certain doors from being opened, and certain truths from taking form in a world that may not be ready to contain them. Her silence, hard-won and carefully maintained, remains the most eloquent statement of all.